Since the forum will be held in English, I will also do this brief introduction in English. I'm very happy to see so many of you. I'm greatly appreciating that the topic is of such great interest to all of you. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is David. I'm a senior research fellow at the GIGA Institute of Asian Studies, and I'm the academic coordinator of this GIGA Forum series. Before we actually delve into the actual forum, I have three small organizational issues I want to part with you. First of all, over on that table you will find not only a couple of Kugelschreiber, thanks. Sometimes the words just elude me. Okay, a couple of GIGA pens. Feel free to take one of them, but only after you, if you want to do so, enter your name into the mailing list, in the newsletter mailing list, which we use to connect with you and inform you about GIGA's news and activities, including, of course, invitations to future GIGA forums. Speaking of which, in 2020, an exciting program awaits you. We have, just to name two examples, a forum on Cuba in April and one on peace and security in the Sahel in the summer. Just to name these two, maybe to get your mouth a little bit watery. While you're over there entering your name, you'll also, of course, find the same possibility to enter yourself into the mailing list and the newsletter on the website. But while you're over there, please take a look at this little stand here where we have some publications which you can take home with you and read them there. And finally, maybe most importantly, following the actual forum, the 90-minute discussion here, in this room we'll have a small reception in the next room where you can mingle with yourself, but also with the panelists and continue the discussions over a glass of wine or water or orange juice. But now to the actual forum. I'm very happy to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Dr. André Bank. He's Senior Research Fellow at the GIGA Institute of Middle East Studies, where he focuses his research on authoritarianism, statehood, and political domination in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Jordan and Syria. And next to his excellent and well-read research, he also has a very strong media presence in Germany. I guess he's one of the most well-known and most interviewed experts in Germany on the war in Syria. Please join me in inviting Dr. Bank to the stage. I'm looking very much forward to an insightful panel and a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's really a great pleasure to welcome you here to this GIGA Forum, and that you've come out here tonight on this rather typical Hamburg weather to listen to and to participate in our first GIGA Forum of this year. It's wonderful to see a number of very familiar faces, some of them first time in a long while, but equally so many new ones. A warm welcome to you all. The topic of today's GIGA Forum is Arab Uprisings 2.0 with a question mark. An end to authoritarianism and corruption, greater participation and better economic policies. These were among the central demands by the protest movement in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region as we call it, on the ruling dictatorships during mass protests around 10 years ago in late 2010 and into the year 2011. Many of you still remember the images from Tahrir Square, perhaps. However, in most countries, probably with the exception of Tunisia, these so-called Arab uprisings, or as others call it, Arab Spring or Arab revolutions, they failed to realize the changes for the better that many had hoped for, both observers and the actual activists, of course. Many countries, among them the 8 Arab monarchies, have continued to, in a way, largely muddle through with their earlier policies, not really substantially changing. In others, such as in Egypt, post-2013, a much harsher, more repressive form of authoritarianism has emerged. And then we have Libya, Syria, Yemen, countries which plunged into disastrous civil wars. Today, almost a decade later, the region finds itself again faced with anti-regime mass protests in a number of countries. In Sudan, mass protests started in December 2018, leading the military to stage a coup against long-term dictator Omar al-Bashir in April of 2019. The protest movement continued after this ousting of the dictator, however, also when the military committed a massacre in the capital of Khartoum in June of 2019, when over 120 protesters died. Still, the civilian movement in Sudan and the military leadership entered into an agreement on a transitional government in August of 2019. In Algeria, mass protests started pretty much exactly 1 year ago, or almost 1 year ago, in February 2019. And moving from North Africa to the Middle East, mass protests have emerged in different places, in Iraq in late September 2019 and continuing until today with the escalation most recently, but also in Lebanon, where the protests started in mid-October. Here, in both countries, both in Iraq and in Lebanon, demonstrators have peacefully protested against corruption, unemployment, and in particular for those two cases, I would say, their country's overarching sectarian systems. So the year 2019 has also witnessed, in addition to those bigger, larger protest movements in the region, shorter-term mass protests in, among others, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, as well as in non-Arab Iran, where they were heavily crushed by regime repression in November of 2019. So the goal of today's GIGA Forum, David has already hinted to it, is to examine these most recent protests in the MENA region, the years 2019 and into this year, and to compare them to the protest wave experienced almost a decade ago. So are we witnessing a kind of second coming of the Arab uprisings, an Arab uprisings 2.0? Or is it actually different steps in a much bigger, longer term process that we should take into consideration? What are the commonalities between the two protest waves? What are their differences? And finally, which effects will the recent conflict escalation between Iran and the US actually have on the protest prospects for bringing about change? Probably we could add the most recent announcements by the US government when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to this. For this forum, we are very happy to have two very knowledgeable and also very well-known speakers, Dr. Maria Yosua and Professor Dr. Mark Lynch. Ladies first. Maria Yosua has been a research fellow at the GIGA Institute of Middle East Studies since 2014, where she has been working on all things authoritarian, one might say. Currently, Maria leads a DFG, German Research Foundation, project on justifying repression in authoritarian regimes with a focus on different North African states. She is one of the few German political scientists who have ever done field research in Algeria on the ground after 2011. And this is only one of the various reasons why I'm very much looking forward to hearing from her about the developments in Algeria over the last year. The second speaker is Mark Lynch. Mark is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., United States. He's also the founder and the director of POMAPS, the Project on Middle East Political Science, arguably the most well-known network for outreach when it comes to political science of and on the Middle East. Mark has authored so many articles and so many books, I won't list them here. He has just edited or authored 3 books on the theme of our forum. The Arab Uprising from 2012, The Arab Uprisings Explained, New Contentious Politics in the Middle East 2014, and the New Arab Uprisings, the New Arab Wars, Uprisings and Anarchy in the Middle East in 2016. On the last one, we were happy to have him here in a previous GIGA forum. Finally, Mark is a contributing editor to the Washington Post's Monkey Cage website, as well as a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So he's not only a well-respected scholar, but also, in a way, a public intellectual in the US and way beyond. Given this amazing experience and expertise, I'm very much looking forward to hearing Mark's insights on the broader trends of the recent protest wave in the region, and also some comparisons to the 2010-2011 Arab uprisings. Finally, in terms of structure for this forum, we will first have the 2 presentations by Maria on Algeria, and then by Mark more comparatively, for each around 12 minutes, directly one after another. And then I will ask them to join me on the podium here and asking them one, in a way, follow-up question. And then we open it up for your comments and questions in the broader Q&A. As David has said, we will close by 7:30 and then continue over drinks. Thank you very much for your attention, and Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invite and for giving me the opportunity to speak on Algeria. So in Algeria, in February 2019, Algeria experienced mass protests after President Bouteflika had announced he would run for a fifth term in the elections scheduled for April. After having suffered a stroke in 2013, Bouteflika has almost never appeared in court, and apparently he has been unable to walk or even to speak. The citizens were complaining that they were not ruled by an actual person, but by a frame, as his picture was hung up in public places where he should be present. Bouteflika had already been re-elected in 2014. Then in 2019, the military and political elites again rallied around him in order to avoid discussing the difficult question of his succession. However, the population was fed up with this impasse that Algeria found itself in. According to a survey, only 10% of citizens viewed the government as competent in solving socio-economic problems. Youth unemployment is high, leading many to thinking about immigration. Corruption is rampant, and the regime is authoritarian, with an opaque structure, a sort of circle of military generals, businessmen, and politicians who decide in mafia-like structures, and of this circle, Bouteflika was rather the public face. In early 2019, citizens took to the streets against Bouteflika, forming the so-called Hirak movement. The Hirak comprises independent civil society, consisting of human rights and youth organizations, opposition parties, lawyers, and independent unions and students. The Hirak mobilized large numbers of protesters each Friday, and students protest each Tuesday. In some weeks, there were over 1 million peaceful protesters in the streets of Algiers and various millions throughout the country. The 2019 uprising stands in stark contrast to the protests that took place in Algeria in 2011 during the original uprisings. Back then, there were only few small protests, and massive police forces overwhelmed the protesters and prevented the demonstrations from growing. On the day of the largest protests in February 2011, 30,000 security forces were deployed, and only 1,500 protesters could assemble. After that, the protest movement quickly split over strategic divisions on how to proceed. One further explanation for why the protests in 2011 were so small is that the experience of the Algerian civil war in the 1990s made citizens afraid of demanding political change. In addition, in 2011, the oil price was rising, and in the oil-rich state of Algeria, social peace is bought through the provision of welfare, such as pay raises and social housing programs. But these material concessions only worked in the short term until oil prices declined. And currently, the Algerian state has lost some of its allocative power. Ever since that time, in 2011, many socio-economic protests have been staged for the rights of the unemployed or against fracking in the south of the country. But also, there have been many political protests, inter alia by soccer fans, culminating in the 2019 protests. So in 2019, the police and gendarmerie have been unable to contain the protests. The security forces have so far refrained from using lethal force, but they still violently disperse protesters. They often detain activists, even if for only short periods of time. The police also try to inhibit mobilization by cutting off access to the capital. More generally, the authorities have restricted the opposition's possibilities to organize and coordinate. Many of civil society's public meetings and events are outlawed. High-profile activists have also been imprisoned, and the judiciary often hands them harsh prison sentences. In March 2019, Bouteflika tried to appease the protesters through piecemeal concessions, but this did not work. Finally, the military recalculated its preferences, and the army chief of staff, Ahmed Salah, called on the Constitutional Council to declare Bouteflika unfit for office. So after 20 years as president, Bouteflika finally stepped down on the 2nd of April. As you can see here, he's looking very frail in his wheelchair and barely able to hand over his resignation papers to the guy that then gives it over to the transitional president. The protest movement rejoiced over Bouteflika's resignation, but upheld its mobilization to demand that the rest of the authoritarian elite leave, with the slogan, "They should all go." The army tried to push for new elections in April and then in July to restore normalcy, but the protesters rejected this and didn't accept the military's open role in politics. Citizens also rejected the transitional government, and they demanded a real transitional phase with a constitutional assembly that would first form a new constitution and then have presidential elections afterwards, as most Algerians wished for a complete change of the authoritarian system. A so-called dialogue process between the street and politicians failed because the army chief rejected the protesters' precondition to release arrested activists, and that he was even overruling the interim president. So with Bouteflika's fall, the military stepped into the front line of politics. In 2019, it was obviously the army chief, Ahmed Gaid Salah, who called the shots. He purged many former elites to bolster his legitimacy with the population, who denounced corruption. But this happened in military show trials, in closed trials, where some former generals, intelligence chief, and high-ranking politicians were convicted to harsh sentences of up to 20 years in jail. Now, anyone who criticizes the army leadership risks repression. In addition to that, especially Kabylian activists are under attack. So Kabylia is a Berber region that is notorious for its resistance to central government policies. And in the current protests, of course, Kabylians are also active, and some of them have been arrested for carrying their flag. Now, under pressure from the Army Chief of Staff, presidential elections took place on the 12th of December, against heavy criticism by the protesters, but also political parties and judges' associations. Only 5 candidates were allowed to run in the elections, and all of them were former ministers or prime ministers. There seemed to be some disagreement within the military, as different generals backed different candidates. But unsurprisingly, the one closest to the Army Chief of Staff won, Abdelmajid Tebboune. However, not many people voted at all. The true participation rate might have been below 10%, and many of those who voted were probably security personnel or other state employees. Now, Ahmed Gaid Salah surprisingly passed away shortly after the elections, and a new chief of staff has taken over the army. The new president, Tebboune, appears willing to reduce the military's role a bit, but it remains to be seen in how far. It's up to him to decide that. He used to serve as the prime minister under Bouteflika in 2017, but he was purged after only 3 months because he was fighting, or he planned to fight corruption too seriously. However, his reputation is also somewhat doubtful because his son serves jail time after being convicted in a huge cocaine smuggling scandal. The prime minister that has been appointed is a technocrat with the name Uprisings. He's a professor of international relations, but of course he's also a former functionary of the ruling party. So what has Tebboune done until now? Responding to some of the protesters' demands, he had some political prisoners released, but many actually still remain in jail. So, for example, the painter of this lovely painting has been released from jail, but many other high-profile activists are still imprisoned. Tebboune also announced a revision of the constitution, another core demand of the Iraq. A committee of law professors is currently preparing a draft behind closed doors. So one downside is that the committee is headed by an old elite who did exactly the same thing a few years ago after the Arab uprisings. So I don't expect very much from that core process. And of course, the Iraq demanded to be included in drafting the constitution, whereas the official plan is now to consult with civil society and other organizations only afterwards when the draft is ready, before holding a referendum. So one can expect that a redistribution of power is quite unlikely. There is another new legislative project, which is a law against hate speech and regionalism. An interesting mix, but obviously this is geared against civilian activism, so this is also a worrisome development. Now, what can we expect from 2020, or what is a possible outlook? A positive scenario would mean that the GIGA would be integrated better into politics, with more concessions, the freeing of political prisoners, of course, and a more open constitution-making process that would lead to a higher participation of the citizens through some form of power sharing. However, this is quite unlikely because of the high stakes that the different players hold, especially the military, but also businessmen and incumbent political elites in the parliament and so on. And many in the GIGA don't want a cheap compromise as long as the root of their demands is not tackled. In a more negative scenario, the leadership would opt for higher repression. This is not fully unlikely because until now there have been mainly symbolic gestures by the new president, and the army is basically retaining its old role. Old conditions with a new president could lead to a hardening of, on both sides, with the security forces increasing repression in order to get people off the streets and to divide the protest movement. However, this is also difficult because the GIGA has maintained peaceful mobilization for almost a full year. So it would be really hard to legitimize its repression now. So what I think is most likely at the moment is an orientation towards the status quo, some cosmetic reforms, some divisions or demobilization of parts of the GIGA, but no real solution of the underlying problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. That was actually a great segue into the issues that I wanted to talk about today. First, I did want to thank GIGA for having me back. It was a wonderful experience to talk about my book here a few years back, and it's really wonderful to be back. The forum for today was titled Arab Uprisings 2.0 with a, I believe, very strategically placed question mark. I think that question mark is very well warranted. But maybe not for the reasons that other people think so. So I'm looking forward to our discussion about it. So I would say that on the one hand, it is very, very clear that what's happening in the region right now is a series of protests across multiple countries, which is at least as impressive as what happened in 2011, and arguably more impressive than what happened in 2011. The protests that have taken place in Algeria, Sudan, in Lebanon, Iraq, in Iran, in Gaza, which always gets left out with the March of Return, these protests have been remarkably long-lasting, disciplined, and have managed to sustain themselves at a time when most of the academic community and most of the general populations in these countries had every reason to believe that there was no possibility of mounting such protests. It's very difficult right now, perhaps, to recapture how demoralized and how frustrated and, frankly, how scared many Arab would-be activists and citizens were after the failures of 2013, 2014, and 2015. And perhaps when we look at the spectacle today of Shia militias gunning down Iraqi protesters and hundreds of people being killed, and the brutality of that, perhaps we forget that in 2013, the Egyptian regime massacred 1,000 people in broad daylight in the center of Cairo to break up a protest. Or maybe we forget that in 2011, Bahrain, with the support of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, forcibly cleared the streets and launched a massive campaign of brutal sectarian repression, which led to thousands and thousands of people being tortured, fired from their jobs, facing fierce and violent repression. So 2011 was a moment which absolutely shattered many convictions about the nature of Arab politics. It was a revolutionary moment. It toppled multiple regimes. And I in no way mean to downplay the significance of 2011. But in 2019, for the number of people to come out into the streets in the way that they did, knowing that what awaited them was regime brutality or the possibility of a civil war such as happened in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, with basically no successful role model outside of Tunisia suggesting that change might be possible, 2019 seems to me to be even more impressive as a manifestation of popular discontent with failed governance, corruption, and all of the other issues with which both Maria and Andre began to outline. And so, is this an Arab uprising 2.0? Despite what I've just said, I think the answer to that is no, it's not. And the reason for that is because the Arab uprising 1.0 was not particularly novel either. I see what's happening as a generation-long, almost at this point 20-year cycle of rising mass mobilization against failed governance, which goes in a cyclical pattern as protesters begin to find ways to successfully get into the streets and challenge these regimes, only to be met with the adaptation by those regimes determined to hold on to power at all costs. And so what I see is happening in 2019 is simply an ongoing manifestation of the same underlying social process across the region, and increasingly, much more so than in 2011, tied into global trends of a large-scale rising protest against failed governance, corruption, economic problems, and stagnant politics in Europe, in Africa, in Central Asia, and more globally. Now, there are some things about this particular wave of uprisings which are different, and those are the things which I was asked to talk about, and I'd like to flag a few of them and kind of discuss which parts and why I think they're significant. The first is, as I said, that these protests have lasted a long time. Algeria has gone on for a year. Sudan, they were in the streets for roughly 8 months before they finally succeeded. In Iraq and in Lebanon, protests have been sustained over the course of nearly 6 months. In Iran, the protests, depending on how you count, actually began in 2017 and have come out repeatedly in the face of escalating regime violence. Now, this is both a good and a bad thing, depending on how you think about it. The iconic Arab uprising, the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, only lasted 18 days. Tunisia lasted less than a month. And in most of the other cases, the challenge quickly evolved into either something which regimes contained, as in the cases of Jordan, Morocco, and cases like that, or quickly descended into violence, as in the case of Libya and Syria. I would say that only Yemen, of all of the iconic Arab uprising cases, is similar to what we've seen in the cases that are happening in 2019. Sustained, long-term, non-violent challenges to an entrenched regime. The advantage of that kind of long, sustained challenge is that it can create a long-term culture of popular engagement. It can create meaningful coalitions. People forget that in Yemen in 2011 to 2012, you saw fairly robust cross-ideological cooperation between the Houthis and the Islamists and the reformists, which actually lasted an extended period before collapsing into violence later. In the case of Sudan, Algeria, it is unbelievable to me, as someone who observed the previous decade, how much cooperation has been sustained by civil society and by the organizers of these protests to remain nonviolent, to remain disciplined, not giving in to regime offers for partial reform or superficial change. And so this gives me hope that even if regimes don't topple, societies have fundamentally changed over the long term. The downside of these long-running, long-sustained mobilizations is that regimes become comfortable with them. In Algeria, and Maria might disagree, but my sense is that the Hirak became a ritual, a carnival. Everybody came out every weekend, and that's what you do on Friday. And the regimes can live with that. Where regimes have trouble are with these sudden, dramatic changes in the status quo, which then they are forced to respond. But as protest becomes ritualized, it can be accommodated. And then, as you look at Lebanon right now, which is in the middle of not just ongoing protests, but the worst financial and banking crisis, arguably in the country's history, in which there's almost a universal agreement that the political system has failed, and yet nothing happens. And they bicker over the number of seats in the cabinet and go on and on and on and on, and nothing changes. And so there's a real fear, on the one hand, that protests can become normalized and accommodated. The other risk is that nonviolence will not be sustained, simply because, on the one hand, regimes have every interest in trying to force protesters to become violent, amping up the repression, beating people in the streets, using tear gas, provoking in just the right way, because they know as soon as people start picking up guns, they lose. The protesters know that as well, and they've been amazingly disciplined at not turning violent in almost every one of these countries. But at a certain point, these are young people. They're not going to take this forever. It's easy to create false flags. It's easy to have people go out in the streets and start throwing rocks at banks and create a violent type situation. And as in the case of Iraq, it's very easy for militias to go and start shooting people in the streets, daring protesters to respond. As soon as these turn violent, we enter a different phase. Protesters know that, and they're trying to resist it. But the longer it goes on without resolution, the greater the risk of a collapse into violence. One other big change, or one other big issue that's worth thinking about is the role of external powers. I would say that the contribution of the external powers to the Arab uprisings of 2011 was almost universally negative. I would say that whether you're talking about the role of the UAE and Saudi Arabia in promoting counter-revolution and autocracy after 2013, or if you're talking about the role of Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia in promoting insurgency in places like Yemen, Libya, and Syria, the role of external powers was almost universally negative in terms of warping and shaping the Arab uprisings of 2011 in bad directions. In 2019, there is great suspicion across many of these cases of external involvement, which is well earned from 2011. Algeria, again, I think is unique because they have a long tradition of hating everybody. And of kind of a nationalism which rejects external involvement. I think it served them well. Sudan came extraordinarily close to becoming the plaything of the Emirati-Qatari rivalry, but they pulled back at the last minute. We hope that can be sustained. In Iraq, in Iraq and Lebanon, it's an unusual situation because the governments are, in some fundamental sense, Iranian-backed. And there's a sense there's something different about a popular uprising which challenges Iran instead of challenging American-backed allies. I actually think this is completely wrong, to be perfectly honest. I think that Iran has become a status quo power in many of these countries, and the challenges against it are the same challenge in Lebanon and Iraq, are the same challenges that are made against American and Gulf-backed regimes elsewhere. Corruption, economic failure, political paralysis, violence, repression. The demands are fairly universal. The difference is the way that Iran has penetrated into these states in the form of militias and non-state actors, which creates a rather different type of dynamic than you saw where in cases such as Egypt or most of the other Arab countries where economic and military assistance went directly into state institutions, into the formal institutions of the military. The non-state dimension of Hezbollah, the IRGC, in its various forms in Iraq does create a different dynamic. The violence that has been carried out in Iraq is absolutely unacceptable, and it's been brutal, but I will remind you, as I did before, that what happened in 2011 and in 2013 was every bit as violent and brutal. There's nothing unique about Iran in terms of using violence against protesters. So there's a number of other things I wanted to say, but I want to be sure to leave plenty of time for discussion. I will highlight one thing very quickly, and that's simply the role of social media in all of this. This was something I spent a lot of time researching and writing about myself in 2011. In 2019, it's very clear that social media, again, is important in terms of spreading images, enhancing collaboration and the like. But cyberspace is very different now than it was in 2011. It's been weaponized, and the regimes have colonized it in fundamentally different ways. The role of bot armies, of cyber manipulation, really changes how the politics of this plays out. It's not just activists using Twitter to organize anymore. And this is a real danger for those of us who are studying it from abroad, because we can get a very misleading picture of what's happening from social media in different ways than we did in 2011. Because I'm coming from Washington, many of you probably have questions about the American role in all of this. I will say that, so do we, that the United States, I'm happy to answer questions about it. All I'll say is that in Washington, the focus on Iran over everything else and the downgrading of anything related to democracy and human rights, I think has led to a real disregard to what I've been talking about. There's very little attention in Washington to these uprisings unless it can be used to target Iran. And so there's some enthusiasm for the protesters in Iraq because that might weaken Iran, although they fundamentally misread that situation there. And there's enormous enthusiasm for the idea that Iran's protesters might be supported in some way to overthrow the Islamic Republic, which would also be in my view, a hugely negative decision, and a misreading of that situation. But if you want the view from Washington, I'm happy to share it beyond that. Thank you.
Quite a different view from up here. Thanks very much, Maria and Mark, for these two very substantial and very engaging presentation, which took deliberately two very different perspectives, one from inside one country over 1 year, and the other one a more broader view on the region. Before we open this up, let me ask each one of you a follow-up question. First on Maria. Maria, where do you see some of the similarities in the developments in Algeria over the last year in comparison to other trends that we've seen either in the region, some of what Marcus outlined, or previously in the face of the early Arab uprisings? And where are some of the major differences? So in which case do you see the Algerian patterns as broader patterns, or where is it very unique?
What I think is very similar historically, but also in a comparative manner, is the grievances that the protesters have. So basically, it's everywhere the same root causes that drive people to the streets: corruption, unemployment. We've talked about them. But especially these age-old authoritarian structures that keep people from participating. What is really different today is this harsher climate that also Marcus mentioned. So in Algeria, what you could say is that all of the root causes have basically exacerbated, and the only thing that has changed is that public space has been narrowed. So for example, there is a law that restricts the freedom of assembly through prohibiting unarmed gatherings. So when you're on the street, it's an unarmed gathering as opposed to an armed gathering. So that's like the mindset the Algerian government was working with. So in 2019, this really upholding of the mobilization over such a long time to attain a lasting change is, I guess, a very important lesson from 2011, as Marcus also pointed out. This huge mobilization that we've seen with millions of people, this really makes Algeria one case very comparable to the big uprising cases of 2011. So Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and of course last year in Iraq, Sudan, and Lebanon. And this complete peacefulness is really totally remarkable. On the other hand, what sets Algeria apart from many of the other cases is the restraint by security forces. So we have a really low level of repression. So of course they go to the streets, they beat the protesters with batons, they have water cannons, but then the protesters sing, "Bring us the shampoo too." So they engage in the contestation, and they're not afraid of the police, because they know that the police know that they must not shoot them, because otherwise an escalation might also be to their detriment. So the sheer size of the protests is just too much for the Algerian policing to handle. On the side of the state strategies, I totally agree with Mark that the regime is somewhat comfortable now. So I would put it that way, that the regime is just trying to ignore the protests. So they're saying it's what they're doing on Fridays and on Tuesdays, we don't care, we just continue forever. But of course there were some changes also. So this military changing its preferences and abandoning Bouteflika, who hadn't done anything anyhow, so this is similar to Tunisia, Egypt, and finally also something like Sudan last year. But afterwards, the military has really maintained a strong role as a veto player in this interim phase, and it really set the agenda. So that was comparable to the situation in Egypt. And Bouteflika's approach, just saying, okay, please elect me, but then afterwards I will implement reforms, and then you can elect somebody else in free elections. And the protesters said, really, no? And then saying, okay, I will not send in the elections, but please let me be president until the elections. And the protesters were, okay, no. So this piecemeal concessions until he finally realized that stepping down is the only thing that sort of compares to the very slow resignation process of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. So that is another funny coincidence with Yemen. But then the attempt to really solve this huge legitimacy crisis through elections under authoritarian conditions is similar to many electoral processes that we've seen in really many of the countries. Especially those with smaller protests, such as Algeria itself back in 2013, but also Jordan, Morocco, but even Syria. Think that there were presidential elections and stuff that were done just like that. And the constitutional reform that is on its way now has also been present in Jordan and Morocco. So these state strategies are really tried and tested in different situations, but they come together in a new combination, one can say. And the lack of compromise, especially on the side of the regime, is something that is really striking and a difference to other cases such as Sudan, where you really had a compromise that was achieved.
Thanks again, super substantial. Mark, let me get back to one of the points that you said at the end of your talk, and that is the role of regional and international actors and factors. So you highlighted, in a way, the counter-revolutionary forces mostly from the region in 2011, the Saudis and Emiratis and so on, what my colleague Thomas Richter has called the GCC, the Global Counter-Revolution Council. In a way, on this level, and also the ambivalence of the US. But do you actually see from within the region or from outside the region also actors, more specifically, that could also support in one way or another some of these transitions? Or would it be much better for everyone, for the US, for the Europeans, and for regional actors, in a way to stay out and let this happen locally, nationally?
Well, those are good questions. In terms of the U.S. approach to it, one of the things which I think is interesting is that the place where the U.S. has probably been the most productive is the one which it cares about the least, and also which is not in its Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, and that's Sudan. So in the Sudan, which was run by the Africa Desk, where there was already kind of a real hostility to the Bashir regime and the legacies of Darfur and the like, there was actually a constituency in the U.S. government that just wanted to see a transition away from Bashir and was in favor of the change that was happening there. And because Sudan is so marginal from the Arab-Israeli conflict, from the Gulf, it was something where there wasn't a high-level attention, so Trump couldn't, so Trump wasn't involved. And so in a sense that they were able to play a role there in kind of supporting the transition. They had some very strong statements about the violence against the protesters, where it was clear that that had gone a little too far. And then they're trying to marshal international funds in support of the transition. So I'll say something positive about Sudan. Beyond that, I think that the role of the United States and almost every other external actor is probably going to end up being negative. In the sense that they are mostly trying to prop up a status quo which has failed, and to the extent that they're willing to see reform, they want that reform to be within the contours of that same regime. So the United States, the GCC, the others, where they are going to support change from below, it's going to be for one of two reasons. It's either going to be because they think it's necessary to keep the regime itself in power. The problems have gone so far, you need to reform so that you don't fall. And that's been basically the core of US democracy promotion since forever. And then the other is if the currently sitting government is an enemy, at which point you want to throw gasoline on the flames and try and make things worse. And so in Iran, for example, every manifestation of popular mobilization or protest in Iran is then spurred on from the outside by the Gulf, by the United States, to try and promote it, make it go, try to see if you could bring about regime change from below in conjunction with the sanctions and everything else. And so I think those strategies are fairly easy to understand. The one which is, the two that are the most interesting and problematic right now are Lebanon and Iraq. So traditionally, there's been a general consensus in the US government about the importance of basically keeping those two countries together. And so it's not that anyone in the US liked Hezbollah, they obviously didn't, but they saw the stability of Lebanon as resting upon maintaining a general equilibrium in which Hezbollah did its thing, but left the government to Hariri and let Lebanon go on basically being ungoverned, and that's largely broken down. And there you just basically see the U.S., like all external actors, kind of looking at what's happening in Lebanon and having no answer to it whatsoever. They don't just want to bail out the government in its financial crisis. They don't want to keep providing economic assistance to the Lebanese National Army because they see that as subservient to Hezbollah. So they don't know what to do. They basically punted on Lebanon. And probably the less they do, the better. But the most worrisome has been in Iraq, where, for better or for worse, whether you supported or opposed the war in Iraq. I opposed the war in Iraq, and I was very much in favor and a vocal advocate of U.S. withdrawal from Iraq back in 2007, 2008, 2009. By the time you get to the counter-ISIS campaign and U.S. forces going back in to fight against ISIS, there was a broad, I think, consensus, bipartisan consensus in Washington that the survival of the Iraqi government was a core national interest. We had put blood and treasure into creating that government for all of its flaws. It was necessary to contest Iranian influence from within by maintaining good relations with the Iraqi government and Iraqi politicians, and it was important to prevent ISIS from winning or reconstituting. And that was a very strong consensus. Sometime over the last year or so, as the campaign against Iran heated up, a counter consensus began to take hold in the White House and at the top of the State Department that the Iraqi government had become so penetrated and controlled by Iran that we should no longer treat it as an ally. And that the United States basically, in a fundamental way, withdrew its support from the Iraqi government, not completely, not fully, and in a fragmented way. So the Pentagon still was very committed to fighting alongside its Iraqi partners against ISIS, even as the government, the White House and the State Department were, in a sense, withdrawing their support for that government. It's a very confusing situation. If you're an Iraqi politician, you're getting mixed messages from the White House, from the State Department, from the Pentagon, from everybody. And I think a tremendous amount of confusion set in there. And so that's the one where I think the U.S. is doing the most active harm in terms of its mixed messaging and failure to confront that reality. And you see that escalating with the assault, with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the Mohandas, the leader of one of the leaders of popular mobilization forces in Iraq, extraordinarily destabilizing to the Iraqi government, and the sort of thing which would have, I think, been avoided in the past.
Thanks for sharing this very sobering picture. I think it's quite remarkable what you just said about the US's perspective on, especially also on Lebanon, that an issue of potentially not holding the country together, which in the past has always been very much of an interest viewed vis-a-vis the Israeli interest of keeping a kind of relatively stable northern neighbor, if that might break down.
Can I just add one thing to that? It's not about the uprisings per se, but it's broader than that. So,
Yeah.
for example, the U.S. has always, and I literally mean always, viewed Jordan as a primary ally, and it's viewed the survival of the state of Jordan as fundamental to the American posture in the region. And I think that, as you saw with the rollout of the Israeli-Palestinian plan yesterday, with absolutely no regard for Jordan and with extreme consequences for Jordan if implemented, I think a lot of Jordanians no longer believe that that commitment still holds. And I think you see this kind of in motion in ways beyond just the uprisings, but kind of more broadly speaking about these seemingly settled consensus positions in U.S. foreign policy that are one by one simply being abandoned.
Yeah. Thanks. This year we will also not only have massive changes in our region, but also in the US, some would say hopefully. I think it's time right now to open this up and to bring in your comments and questions. And to do so, I would suggest that you probably stand up, that everyone can see you, that you briefly identify yourself, and that you try and not talk way too long. And in a way also address your comment and question to one of us on the panel. I see Asma, Arsu, and then the two colleagues up front.
Thank you both for your presentation. My question is to Dr. Joshua. Yes. So you mentioned briefly the Kbaili conflict of the Amazigh protesters. So as you know, the movement is actually quite layered, right? I mean, demands within demands, etc. And that the Kbaili specifically have been mobilizing since the 80s. And several instances where the Algerian military had sent tanks to Tizi Ouzou, for instance. Do you see the repression? Because protesters who are holding Amazigh flags have been sentenced for over 20 years. So do you see that the repression, specifically the Amazigh protesters, as a sign of security, especially since the Kbaili Republic was announced earlier in the decade, now we can say earlier in the decade, in Paris? So do you see that specifically seeing it as a threat since the Kbaili looks over at the independence? And I wanted to, if allowed, add one more factor to why these protests are more successful. 2011 not only taught movements so many lessons about endurance, but civil society has been rising so much in capacity all over the region. I mean, there's been associations and trainings in multiplying, also regional networking, which has worked so much, because I know now there are signal groups between protesters of Sudan and protesters in Egypt, learning from each other actually on how to tackle our challenges. So I just wanted to add that there. Thank you.
And this is Asma Khalifa, doctoral
Oh,
student at the
sorry.
GIGA. We can take one more.
Arzu Yılmaz from Hamburg University. My question is to Mark Lynch. Actually, by making this comparison between 2011 and 2019, I think we should also put into consideration a very destructive process which took place by the emergence of ISIS. So my first question is actually, what might be the impact of ISIS, the emergence of ISIS or the fight against ISIS on these newly demonstrations? And in relation with this, in Iraq particularly, but to some extent in Lebanon also, the demonstrations are taking place in the Shia populated regions. For instance, just a couple months ago I was in Iraq and Sunni region, and people, even Sunni people in Baghdad, and the Kurds as a whole keep their distance. And what might be the reason of such a fragmentation in the newly emerging demonstrations? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Maria, you want to start?
Yeah, thanks very much, Asma, for your question. This repression of the Amazigh region is really something that has been like with the Algerian state for a couple of decades. I would say already in 2011, the regime tried to play on this identity question. So in between they framed like all protesters as Berbers or something like that in order to divide the protest movement. And we see a little bit of that now also. So this is especially like critical after having given the Amazigh population more rights. So they have a better status now than they did like 10 years ago, but still on no legal basis, the some of the people carrying the flags have been jailed. So it's not 20 years, but it's like just a few months or so, but still there is no legal basis for even jailing them. And we've seen a couple of like assaults. So one is at the protests. Then there is another development that is closing down Protestant churches in these areas. So there are like many Protestants in this region, which is probably a little known fact. Even if they are like officially recognized, they have been shut down over the past month, so a dozen of them or so. So this is all like sort of attacking the specific identity of this region and trying to really enforce sort of Algerian Muslim Sunni mainstream where you have your outlook that you come from the revolution, from the independence war, or something like that, and you're not allowed to have any other opinions, identities, whatever. And this really trying to bring an identity question into this protest movement is like one of the, trying to sow the seeds of division, which we might see more of that in the near future. And the region, of course, is really extraordinary. So during the elections, they totally resisted even holding elections. Some mayors didn't even lend their premises to holding the elections. In Bijaya also, people were just running into the polling station, closing it down, throwing out all the ballots. So they are really resisting and not taking any of the central government policies. So that's quite impressive.
Thanks. Mark?
Elspeth, that's a great point about the growth of civil society and the collaboration across and learning across the different cases. And one of the things which is so interesting is how much of it is non-visible compared to 2011, where 2011, like I wrote a number of articles at the time where you could actually track this on Twitter, because at that time, Twitter was still like a public thing and it hadn't been totally corrupted by states and bots and that sort of thing. So what you're describing took place out in the open, and you're right, now it's migrated to WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups and Signal and things like that, which is only available to people in network. So you see it manifesting, but you don't get to observe it unless you're in that network, which actually poses a really interesting challenge to future researchers. I hope that a lot of those activists are archiving those groups and then we'll make those available at some point. But the learning across borders is really clear, and it's really, really interesting to see. And you saw that, so there's some of that with Sudan and Egypt. I know some of the people there, but the Sudan to Algeria connection was, because there was very little prior knowledge or interaction there, and yet you saw them very quickly, and you would see it just like in 2011, in real time, suddenly slogans would change, or there would be an initiative by the Algerian government, and you would see Sudanese suddenly saying, "Don't take the bait, don't do it," or the other way around. And so that was really interesting to see, and I think that's an underappreciated dimension to all of this. So yes, great point. On the question of ISIS and the effect that it had, I mean, that's a huge question. I would say that the effect when it emerged in 2014, 2015 were very much part of the overall eruption of fear and the overall failure of the uprisings, that perception of the failure of the uprisings led to all these horrible things, the war in Syria, the rise of ISIS, the Egyptian coup, and it's kind of part of all of that. But move past that and look at where we are now. The ISIS, there are like three big things that made it different from other Islamist jihadist insurgencies. There was the decision to actually create a state instead of remaining a non-territorial insurgency. There was the use of kind of extreme violence in media as kind of a marker of its own identity, but also as a form of intimidation and recruitment, which was similar to what Al-Qaeda had done, but much more extreme. And then third, it was the ability to attract foreign fighters in much greater numbers and from much more diverse backgrounds. If you look at what it is right now, the state project in Iraq and Syria has completely failed. I mean, as soon as they created a state in Iraq and Syria, they created a target for the U.S. military, which then, over the course of several years, working with Iraqi forces and the SDF in Syria and the like, they completely destroyed that state. That was their political project, and it completely and totally failed at enormous cost. And so one of the lessons that future insurgents and Islamists will learn is don't create a state which can be destroyed. Now, many of the people who were members of ISIS who weren't killed, of course, they've gone underground and they're going to try and reconstitute as an insurgency. And recent events in Iraq and the withdrawal from Syria will help them to do so. And I have no doubt that there will be new forms of jihadist insurgency which will take hold in those areas in Iraq and Syria, largely because of the absence of any effective central authority, the absence of any meaningful reconstruction assistance, the failure to provide meaningful security there. The people are there, they're going to find ways to fight, they'll adapt, and they won't do the same things that ISIS did because those things failed. But this is very much this like Darwinian environment where successful projects succeed and failed ones fail, and then what emerges always seems to be more violent, more effective, and so that will be there, but in a different form. But the ability to attract the foreign fighters is slow to a trickle. Basically, people in Europe don't seem to be interested in going to a failed project to die. And so the people who are attracted to that sort of thing might not necessarily be de-radicalized. They'll go someplace else and do something else. And what that thing is hard to say. But I suspect that you're not going to see a single focal point of recruitment of foreign fighters like you saw in the Iraq, Syria, Islamic State anytime in the near future. I think we're heading back to a decentralized, deterritorialized terrorist networks combined with localized insurgencies, which will be of varying effectiveness and under varying brand names. I think the Islamic State brand name is not really attractive anymore. The Al-Qaeda brand name isn't very attractive anymore. They'll find a new brand name. And that'll still be there. Question about the Shia regions is super interesting, and I'll try and be brief, Andres. I see you getting fidgety. In Lebanon, I would say that it's not just in the Shia areas. Actually, it's determinedly non-sectarian. There's been a remarkable effort on the part of protesters to create a non- and actually anti-sectarian narrative in the protests. I think that the recent trends, especially Hezbollah forcing through a government that it backs, is trying that as Shia kind of leave the streets, and it becomes, it kind of everything in Lebanon defaults back to sectarianism, because even though the protesters are mobilized against it, this has always been the problem. You've seen the same thing in 2015 with the Houston protest. You see the same thing. Protests against sectarianism routinely fail because the entire system is so structured by sectarianism, and to me that's one of the really sad lessons of Lebanon right now. In Iraq, the protests are happening in the Shia areas because that's where people have been most failed by the government. You would think that they control the government, therefore resources should have been flowing into the south and into Sadr City, and life should have gotten better, but it hasn't because of corruption, because of all the various failures and incapacities of the Iraqi state. These people have nothing to show for it, and so they've been protesting in steadily growing numbers in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and then really erupting now in 2019. And it's been happening in Basra, it's been happening in Najaf, it's been happening in Sadr City, and this is, I think, directly tied to the very specific failures of the Iraqi state to its own Shia constituents. The Kurds want nothing to do with it. They want to have their own state, and they failed in their bid for independence a year or two ago, but they are not influenced by the same dynamics because they expect nothing from the Iraqi state and they're not protesting against it. And the Sunnis out there in Anbar and Nineveh provinces are absolutely traumatized. They just, they were just liberated from control by ISIS. They were brutalized during that period. Massive displacement, massive destruction, almost no reconstruction whatsoever. And so, in a sense, they're far too traumatized and fragmented to join in those protests, even if they wanted to. So I think that what is basically left of the functional reach of the Iraqi state is the Shia population in the south and Baghdad, and that's where the protests are happening. I think because that's basically all that's left.
Thanks. Two gentlemen up in the front.
Hi, I'm Andrea Teti, temporarily at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Bologna. First of all, thank you very much for your interventions. They're really, really interesting, and the Q&A afterwards. I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit more about any trends that you see might be significant in the goals, the tactics, the organizational forms of protest movements. So you've mentioned that they're extremely resilient and that they've, remarked on the mass protest nature from Yemen all the way to Algeria. What has allowed these forms to be sustained beyond simply these kind of absorptive tactics by regimes? Thank you.
Volker from the University of Freiburg, thank you.
I have a short question to Maria. You mentioned that there might be some conflicts within the Algerian army, and I wondered, can we elaborate this a bit more in terms of who is behind the scene in power in Algeria? Because I always struggle, is it the secret service, is it the army, is it somehow a mix of forces, is it maybe business circles? So what is the deep state? And you showed this cartoon where this uniformed hand was placing the new president into his chair. So who's behind this hand? And maybe to you, Mark, thank you. I was wondering how Russia and Turkey comes into the picture when we think about Iraq and Iran, particularly after the downing of the passenger jet in Tehran. It seems to me that the conflict between the US and Iran is somehow on ice, if I'm not somehow misleading it at the moment. So how is Russia and Turkey fulfilling their task or their job to do?
Thanks. Very small questions. Still, I hope for a bit shorter answers, if possible, so that we can give more people more chance. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'm a bit sick. I hope I can talk through my very short answers. Andrea, as regards to the question, so regarding the trends in the protest movements, I would say this really overarching way of trying to bring very diverse forces together is really something new. In Algeria they tried it in 2011. It didn't really work that well, so they quickly dissipated. And in 2019 they have formed various smaller initiatives under different headers, bringing together different people with different, also partly contradictory strategies. So some were proposing going for the elections and then trying to pursue more changes afterwards. Others were proposing going for full reform from the outset, and so they've slowly found their way of trying to find to really go where they find that they can come together under a common platform and really try to sustain their coordination against all the attempts by the government to outlaw their activities and events and so on. But let's see how this will proceed. What I find interesting as regards revolutionary practices is more in the broader population. So as I said, the son of the new president has this cocaine scandal, and in order to protest against the new president, the people in Algiers were throwing flour out of their windows. So to have like white powder everywhere, and they call him the President Cocaine. So they really show their dissatisfaction. And something else they're doing is that they're making noise with kitchen utensils, like clapping on pans and stuff. Something that they did during the War of Independence. So they're like recovering or like reinventing those very old, almost historical practices in order to show their revolutionary zeal. So I think that's quite interesting. Jan, as regards your question, that's like the $1 million question in Algerian politics, who is really the face, or like who is behind le pouvoir. What I was alluding to as like different interests within the military, this goes back to, as we know, there are the Algerian military is very powerful, very important. There are like a couple of generals. Nobody really knows who has how much power. I just read a very long, interesting article on how one of the generals is also important. And then it came out that a totally different general with the name of GIGA became the new chief of staff. So he's the new strongman. And it's not the one that was like said to be the second most powerful man in the army after Gaid Salah. So that is something that is noteworthy. As we know, the military has risen in importance as opposed to the intelligence services. So Bouteflika at some point cut down the strongmen in the intelligence service, and the military rose. But this could also again go into a different direction. So unfortunately, we have no idea. What is interesting about the new chief of staff currently is that he's the first one who actually did not serve in the Liberation Army in the War of Independence. So he basically came afterwards. Instead, he fought in the October War. I didn't know there were Algerians fighting there, but apparently he did. So he has like other credentials, and he's also said to be a like tough guy. So we have absolutely no idea how strong Tebboune is going to be. So Tebboune removed the post of Vice Minister of the Defense that a general would hold in order to keep have one general less in the cabinet. But this thing might be too big for him because he was Gaid Salah's guy, and Gaid Salah is gone. So we really don't know how this will play out in the future.
Thanks. Great, thanks. So in terms of like the trends and goals and tactics and the like, I would say that there's been really interesting trends in the tactics and in the things that they do not want to accept, and less clarity and coherence on what they do want, which is not a criticism of them so much as, I wouldn't know what to tell them to do either. And so what I mean by that is that it's been really interesting and clear that they have learned from the mistakes of 2011, and so they reject a whole series of political bids and moves which might have otherwise been accepted. So don't demobilize before you've gotten everything that you want. Don't allow, get rid of Bashir and replace him with another general and assume that that's enough. Don't, and you see that in country after country. Don't be fooled by early elections where everything is like stacked against you. So in terms of like not accepting those things, they're very, very good. The commitment to nonviolence, the regular occupation of the central space combined with large marches, these are all like very effective protest tactics that you're seeing recurring again in country after country. But in terms of what that leads to, I don't see a very clear theory of change in any of these movements. In other words, it's more just keep pushing and see what happens. Because, for example, in Algeria, Bouteflika was going to go eventually, but who knew that Gaid Salah was going to have a heart attack? Or whatever happened. See? In Sudan, you know, it was not obvious to me that Omar Bashir was going to go, I mean, eventually, but the fact that he was pushed out, I think, really surprised a lot of people, and that's because of the constant pressure which they faced, and the regime kind of had to get rid of him because of the pressure that they faced, and the lack of the non-demobilization, and then Haletti making the decision to launch the attack against the protest encampment, in retrospect, was a disastrous decision, but it didn't seem that way at the time. In fact, at the time, the whole idea was, it's over, they decided to use force, and now it's going to go the wrong way. And that actually brings it back to something that Asma said earlier about the role of civil society where we didn't expect it. So a lot of people thought Sudan couldn't succeed because they didn't have like the civil society, because Middle East experts don't know anything about Sudan. The Sudanese Professional Association was an incredibly well-developed set of institutions across the professional sectors of society, which was able to step right in and organize and give this discipline. In Algeria, you know, you know better than I, but they've been having various forms of protests for like the last 10 years, and that gave a lot of experience to fall back upon when faced with different policing tactics and that sort of thing. So I think that's one of the lessons, is that there's civil society in social organization in places where we don't look for it, where we don't expect to see it. And that's something which I think is one of the most interesting revelations of this period. On the Russia and Turkey, I actually see as, I'm sure there are things I could say about Iraq and Iran, but I don't see them as all that important there. I think where Libya and Syria are the places where you're seeing really dramatic and important changes in both Russian and Turkish policy. Turkey actually, like, rounding up 6,000 Syrian opposition fighters and using them as mercenaries in Libya is a remarkable evolution in their strategy. They're carving out of essentially a buffer zone in northern Syria and then allowing the regime to go and retake everything else. That's a real change in how they're behaving in Syria. And so I think that Turkey has actually changed the Turkish policy, are extraordinarily important, especially I would say in Libya and in Syria. In Iraq and Iran, it's more of a backseat near as I can tell, but certainly they're reacting to the changing alliances and the like.
Thanks. Now we have a cluster in the middle here. Mr. Ambrus is first.
Thank you very much. My name is Jörg Armbruster. I'm a freelance journalist. And Mark, I would like to know from you, you mentioned Sudan. Which perspective has this country to develop in a more democratic way, or do you think it will be the next Egypt?
Thanks. And the gentleman right next to you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Peter Klauer. I'm not an expert, I'm simply interested. What I would like to know is, I do see very few common denominators between all these theaters ranging from Algeria to Yemen to Persia. I do not consider Persia being part of the Arab world, by the way. But one of the few common denominators is no economic performance and very challenging demographics. Are any of these countries, none of which have ever seen something remotely associable with democracy, and do you think that any of these countries are ever fit for a democracy in the sense we believe in it?
Thanks. And then Irina up front. We take 3 right now, and if we have time, you will have the chance.
Okay, and my name is Irene Weipert-Fenner, and I work at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. This is so interesting, so I want to hear more about it, okay? So first of all, just your last remark, Mark, you said that civil society is not coming up with an agenda for change, and this is so remarkably similar to 2011. So protesters remained strangers at the gates, but they didn't want to enter the gates. So this seems to be one similarity which is really striking. So my question to Maria is, you said that the regime is simply ignoring these protests now, yeah, so they get used to them, so they're not disruptive enough, I would say. What about the role of strikes and workers, or something that could hurt, also economically? What about the public? We discussed the question of temporality, so as long as the protests last, or as long as they last, they create maybe an obstacle to the general opinion, becoming tired of protests, becoming tired of really disrupted protests, transportations, everything that comes to a standstill. That's what we saw in Tunisia, for instance, after the revolution. So what about the public then in general? And finally, if it's briefly possible, what's Washington's perspective on the European Union in regard to the Uprisings 2.0 that you don't want to call that way?
Thanks. Yep.
Yes. So I'll start in the back with Irene's last question. Yes, that people become tired of protests is certainly the case in Algeria. So there's been a online survey ongoing via Facebook, which is quite interesting, that shows that over time the acceptance of having protests is diminishing, but still it's the overwhelming majority of the population, or those who answer the survey, and especially the percentage of those who really want change is just like above 80%, even for military members. So this is really striking. You can see that somehow the people are yearning for a different strategy, different tactics to achieve this aim, because they see that the protests are not leading anywhere. But my guess is that they don't really see any other way how to approach this really fierce regime, how to penetrate it and make it give in to some of the demands and concede. And we can really argue that the protests are not disruptive enough. There are scholars who talk about the new normal of having protests all of the time, and this certainly seems to be one of the developments of the past years. Strikes, of course, could be more relevant. However, I mean, in Algeria you have the workers' union that is state organized. So they still try to get some people on the streets to have pro-regime rallies. So from them, not so much is to be expected, but there are many independent unions that could do something, but I'm not really sure how many people they can mobilize. So maybe strikes would be a better opportunity. I don't know. They should try it, and we will find out then. Yeah, about the gentleman and the economic performance. Yes, absolutely. The economy is absolutely down, and this is because of especially in Algeria, because of the reliance on oil exports or gas and now shale gas exports, that they don't have any productive industries. If you do not consider the manufacturing of tanks where Germany provided a factory in the desert and licenses to build 1,000 tanks and also other heavy vehicles. But of course the demographics are really challenging. So I think now it's almost 10 million inhabitants more in Algeria than when the original uprisings took place. So the problem is that really the politicians don't do anything about it. So it's, I wouldn't say that this is the root cause that there can never exist democracy or so, but the root causes are really political, that politics do not want to tackle the economic problems. They don't look for any viable solutions.
Thanks. Mark.
Okay, so can Sudan succeed? Can it become a democracy? I mean, look, the smart money is on no. Right? I mean, the challenges are unbelievable. The economy is a disaster. There's all kinds of regional fragmentation and tribal fragmentation. The current transition is an uneasy compromise between the protesters and the military, which remains in a leading position, but not in the leading position, which is really unusual and extremely important. There's violence spoilers everywhere. You get episodic outbursts of violence out in the Darfur region again. Hemeti is still there controlling his own private militias. The external actors, even if they've been relatively restrained so far, that might not last, and Sudan could easily become an arena for competition between Qatar and the UAE again. There's every reason to think Sudan will fail, but at the same time, they've come much farther and succeeded much more fully than anybody expected them to. And I think there's an enormous amount of goodwill in the international community, and people want to see them succeed. I think that one of the really interesting and unusual things about the Sudan is that typically across every place else in the region, the UAE and Saudi Arabia like to support secular militaries, and Qatar is supporting the societal-based Islamists. But since Sudan had an Islamist military regime, it scrambles all of those decks. And in a sense, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they want to support a military, but they can't find one because they're all Islamists. And Qatar wants to support Islamists, but they can't find any because they're all in the regime. And so in a sense, that insulates them a little bit from the traditional patterns. I think Sudan's going to succeed. I think the odds are very much against it, and luckily I'm not a betting man, so I don't put money on it. But against the odds, I'm actually quite optimistic about the Sudan. Maybe it hasn't just been beaten out of me yet by the rest of the region, but I think Sudan actually has a chance. In terms of this question of the economics and the demographics, this is precisely why I've been arguing forever that the Arab uprisings are going to keep recurring over and over again, because the economics and the demographics are such that these regimes outside of the Gulf region are simply incapable of meeting the demands of their people. And I agree totally with Maria about the role of politicians in this. You would think that facing all of those problems, you might see regimes prioritizing those problems, but instead, regimes typically remain completely predatory, corrupt, and siphoning off whatever resources are made available to them. And so I actually tend to see that the trajectory is likely to be continued popular mobilization, facing against regimes that will do anything possible to survive, not because these countries are not fit for democracy. I don't think that's even the issue. The issue is simply that these are corrupt, empowered, violent regimes which will do anything to stay in power. And as your point about the protesters still coming up with a viable theory of change and unable to find one, that creates this deadlock scenario where you have this episodic renewal of violent or not violent or non-violent protest. Some of these regimes are going to crack. That's what we saw in Algeria and Sudan just now. And others are going to survive, as you've seen in, so far, Iraq and Iran on this wave. But 2 years from now, we're all going to be shocked by the next round of protest in Egypt. And I've been saying this for quite a while now. People think I'm absolutely insane. I think Syria is actually one of the main areas where I expect to see something along the lines of Serbia, the Serbia model, where Milosevic was removed from power after his victorious war because of the economic problems and corruption and sanctions. In Syria right now, the effects of the Lebanese banking crisis on Syria are vastly underrated. People don't appreciate how horrible the Syrian economy is right now. With the war winding down, Assad loses his major justification for the use of violence against protesters. I actually see Syria and Egypt as the two prime candidates for a major recurrence of protest, which will shock everybody 2 years from now. Last question, Reina. Washington's view of the European Union and the uprisings, they don't have one. Nobody cares. But what they do care about is the EU's role in sustaining the nuclear deal with Iran, which they see as something close to treason. And so the form of secondary sanctioning and the pressure on Germany, on the EU to get in line with US policy towards Iran has been tremendous. And if Trump wins again, I think Europe has to fold. I mean, they can't sustain this forever. If they can sustain it and keep the channels alive and keep Iran at some level of compliance for the next 10 months, who's counting, 9 months, and Trump loses, then I think Europe becomes extremely important, because they will have been the lifeline that kept the deal together. Every Democratic candidate is promising to go back to diplomacy, and so it'll be a real turning point. I think Europe becomes largely irrelevant in Middle East diplomacy if Trump wins again, but they have a chance to be extremely important should a Democrat come back, win, and want to try and bring something like the old regional order back in place. So Europe's got a lot riding, I think, on that election, as does everybody.
Thanks very much. I think you've already, right now with your last sentences, showed us a forum towards the end of this year, the beginning of next year, in addition to the ones that David has mentioned. Thanks very much. I'm not gonna end this with a long conclusion on how the question of Arab Uprisings 2.0 question mark has been answered. like many scholars usually would say, the answer would be it depends. And I think that's what we can say here again, but I think what we've really gotten away with after these 90 minutes is a much more informed discussion about the complexities in the region, about the dynamism that the region has, despite of the strong authoritarianism that we see. And I'm very much thankful to both Maria and Mark for these very substantial and engaging talks and discussions, and for your attention and participation. Drinks are waiting outside, and you can continue bi, tri, quadri, or multilaterally on these issues. Thanks very much.